Christopher Plummer was never afraid to say what others only whispered. In an industry built on charm and silence, he spoke plainly. Some co-stars he admired, others he couldn't stand. Behind his elegant performances and old-world wit, Plummer carried a private blacklist. A collection of actors and actresses whose arrogance, ego, or sheer difficult personalities made working with them unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. These weren't minor figures. They were some of the most celebrated names of the 20th century, stars whose reputations towered over Hollywood and the stage. To the public, they were legends. To Christopher Plummer, they were divas, tyrants, chaotic geniuses, and occasionally, ice-cold perfectionists who drove him to the edge. And perhaps the biggest shock of all, one of them was the woman audiences still see as his perfect match. This is the untold story of the 10 actors and actresses Christopher Plummer hated working with the most, a list that reveals as much about him as it does about the icons he clashed with. Number 1. Rex Harrison. Christopher Plummer didn't hand out compliments lightly, and he certainly didn't give them to Rex Harrison. To Plummer, Harrison represented everything he despised in a co-star: entitlement, ego, and a need to dominate every stage he stepped onto. Their clashes weren't quiet, and they weren't subtle. Harrison, famous for My Fair Lady and his velvety, sing-speaking voice, was one of the most celebrated actors of his generation. But to those who worked with him closely, he was also one of the most infamously difficult. Plummer's encounters with Harrison on stage revealed just how unbearable that ego could be. He described him as an absolute monster, a man who strutted through rehearsals with a sense of royal ownership. Harrison expected everyone to orbit him. Directors bent their schedules to accommodate his moods. Fellow actors had to adjust to his timing, his phrasing, his whims. If he felt a scene wasn't focused tightly enough on him, he made sure it would be by the next run-through. Harrison's arrogance was legendary well beyond Plummer. He belittled chorus members, froze out anyone he considered beneath him, and had a reputation for bullying younger actors. Plummer, however, was not intimidated. Classically trained and sharp-witted, he met Harrison's theatrical bravado with cutting humor and thinly veiled disdain. He didn't back down, which only intensified their mutual dislike. For Plummer, acting was about truth and craft. For Harrison, it was about control. Their philosophies clashed at every turn. In interviews years later, Plummer recounted their time together with a mix of amusement and lingering irritation, never once softening his view of Harrison's behavior. He didn't need to exaggerate. Harrison's reputation for arrogance spoke for itself. Rex Harrison was the kind of co-star Plummer could not abide, the diva, who believed the spotlight belonged to him alone. It was a clash of titans, one demanding deference, the other refusing to give it. The result was unforgettable tension, the kind that seeps into every scene, every glance, every line delivered between two men who could barely tolerate sharing a stage. Number 2. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was a towering figure in 20th century theater, revered as one of the greatest classical actors of all time. To generations of performers, he was the gold standard, precise, commanding, and untouchably brilliant. But to Christopher Plummer, working alongside Olivier was as much an education as it was a test of patience. Beneath the respect lay something sharper, a deep frustration with Olivier's condescending manner and relentless need to instruct everyone around him. Plummer admired Olivier's technique, but he didn't enjoy being treated like a student. Olivier had a habit of addressing his fellow actors as if they were apprentices in his personal academy. He dissected line readings, interrupted rehearsals to correct phrasing, and offered unsolicited notes with a theatrical flourish. To many this was inspiring. To Plummer, it was patronizing. He had trained with the best, forged his own identity on the stage, and didn't need a legend hovering over his shoulder. Their encounters often played out like an unspoken duel. Olivier, the knighted authority, would glide into a rehearsal room expecting reverence. Plummer would respond with polite resistance, quietly refusing to be shaped by someone else's vision. He respected Olivier's talent, but had little patience for what he saw as theatrical arrogance. The assumption that one man's brilliance entitled him to dictate everyone else's performance. Olivier also possessed a sharp tongue, famous for withering remarks that could reduce a young actor to silence. Plummer was not easily cowed, but he took note of the way Olivier's presence warped the dynamic around him. Directors deferred to him, co-stars adapted, and productions often bent to accommodate his preferences. It wasn't collaboration, it was dominion. Years later, Plummer would speak of Olivier with a blend of reverence and irritation, calling him extraordinary, but also impossible in his self-importance. He acknowledged the genius, but he never forgot the tone, the raised eyebrow, the perfectly enunciated correction that made working with Olivier a battle of wills. For Christopher Plummer, Laurence Olivier embodied the condescending legend, brilliant beyond question, but so convinced of his own authority that sharing a stage with him felt less like teamwork and more like being cast in someone else's lesson. Number 3. Yul Brynner. Yul Brynner's presence was magnetic. With his shaved head, commanding posture, and unforgettable voice, he ruled the stage and screen like a king. Audiences adored him. Directors relied on him. But to Christopher Plummer, working with Brynner meant stepping into someone else's kingdom, and that was never easy. Plummer saw in Brynner a relentless need for control, the kind of domineering energy that turned every production into his personal empire. Their paths crossed in the theater world, where Brynner's reputation preceded him. He was a star who believed in absolute authority. Lighting cues, blocking, pacing. Nothing escaped his reach. He wasn't content to give a performance. He wanted to shape the entire production around himself. Stage managers tiptoed, co-stars adapted, and technicians adjusted to accommodate his preferences. Plummer, fiercely independent and protective of his craft, bristled at this from the start. He later described Brynner as a little tyrant, a phrase that captured both Brynner's charisma and his overbearing habits. Brynner could be charming one moment and ruthless the next. If he sensed a challenge to his authority, he pushed back immediately. He had spent years perfecting his image as a theatrical monarch, and he expected everyone else to play their roles accordingly. Plummer, however, refused to bow. His background in classical theater gave him both confidence and a subtle edge. He matched Brynner's authority with quiet defiance, never openly confrontational, but unwilling to surrender his own creative space. The result was an undercurrent of tension that colored their time together. Two strong personalities circling each other like dueling captains. What frustrated Plummer most wasn't Brynner's talent, it was the lack of collaboration. Brynner treated the stage like his throne, not a shared canvas. His sense of ownership overshadowed everything else. In Plummer's eyes, that wasn't artistry. It was ego. Years later, Plummer would still refer to Brynner's domineering presence with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. He recognized the star power, but he never forgot the feeling of working under someone who saw himself not as part of a company, but as the unquestioned ruler of it. Yul Brynner, to Plummer, was the quintessential control freak, brilliant, magnetic, but ultimately unbearable to work with. Number 4. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando was the face of a revolution in acting. His raw intensity, naturalism, and unpredictable brilliance changed the craft forever. But for Christopher Plummer, that same brilliance came wrapped in arrogance and chaos. He respected Brando's talent, but he found his attitude toward classical theater and disciplined work utterly infuriating. Plummer came from the old school. Precision, preparation, and reverence for the text were non-negotiable. Brando, on the other hand, dismissed that tradition. He was famously disdainful of Shakespearean acting, calling it stiff and irrelevant. Where Plummer valued structure, Brando prized spontaneity, often walking into a scene as if the script were optional. To many, this made him electrifying. To Plummer, it made him unreliable. Their encounters were marked by deep philosophical differences. Plummer saw Brando as a genius who knew he was a genius, and behaved accordingly. Brando ignored cues, played with lines, and treated the rehearsal process as a burden rather than a privilege. Plummer had no patience for that. He believed respect for one's fellow actors meant arriving prepared, listening closely, and honoring the shared work. Brando, in his eyes, elevated himself above the craft. Brando's ego was matched by his unpredictability. He could deliver a moment of breathtaking brilliance one second, and then derail a scene the next. Directors often allowed it because he was Marlon Brando, but Plummer was not in awe. He saw through the mythos to a man who at times simply couldn't be bothered to put in the same level of discipline that others did. What stung most for Plummer was the cultural divide. He had spent his life in the theater, building his skills on centuries of tradition. Brando represented a new wave that dismissed much of that, not with debate, but with a smirk. It wasn't just a clash of methods, it was a clash of values. In later years, Plummer would still acknowledge Brando's impact. He never denied the power of his performances. But admiration didn't erase the frustration. For Plummer, Marlon Brando was the unreliable genius, breathtaking when he cared, infuriating when he didn't, and a constant reminder that brilliance without discipline was to him a kind of arrogance all its own. Number 5. Richard Burton. Richard Burton's voice could command a room before he even entered it. Deep, resonant, and unmistakable, it was the instrument that made him a legend. To audiences, he embodied tragic heroes and flawed romantics. To Christopher Plummer, however, Burton often embodied something else entirely: boorish arrogance, wrapped in charm and drowned in drink. Plummer and Burton moved in similar theatrical circles, both rising from classical roots into international fame. But while Plummer maintained a sharp discipline throughout his career, Burton became infamous for his indulgences. Plummer admired his talent. Few could deliver Shakespeare with such effortless magnetism, but he was frustrated by the way Burton's personal excesses spilled onto the stage. Their interactions revealed a man who could be brilliant one moment and unbearable the next. Burton loved the spotlight, but he also loved pushing boundaries. He drank heavily, sometimes to the point where performances became unpredictable. Plummer, ever the professional, had little tolerance for that kind of volatility. He didn't romanticize Burton's recklessness. He saw it for what it was: a gifted actor letting ego and indulgence erode his craft. Burton also carried himself with a swagger that bordered on dismissive. He charmed many, but he also had a sharp, mocking edge that rubbed Plummer the wrong way. Their conversations were often laced with playful jabs that occasionally turned barbed. Burton's confidence was magnetic, but it could also tip into condescension when he was in his cups. Plummer wasn't shocked by Burton's behavior. He had seen many brilliant men undone by their appetites, but he found it increasingly hard to respect. He valued preparation, focus, and reverence for the work. Burton valued the thrill of performance and the pleasures that came with fame. It was a fundamental difference in priorities, and it showed. Years later, Plummer would speak of Burton with a mix of respect and exasperation. He never denied the man's talent, but he also never pretended that working with him was easy. Richard Burton was, in Plummer's eyes, the boorish drinking buddy, brilliant, magnetic, but ultimately his own worst enemy. And for someone like Plummer, that kind of waste of talent, of discipline, of potential, was hard to forgive. Number 6. Orson Welles. Few figures in 20th century entertainment loomed as large as Orson Welles, a prodigy who conquered radio, theater, and film before the age of 25. He carried with him an aura of brilliance, and according to Christopher Plummer, an ego to match. Plummer admired Welles's talent, but found working with him to be like orbiting a distant planet, dazzling to look at, impossible to influence, and always pulling everything into its own gravity. Plummer and Welles crossed paths in theatrical settings, where Welles's reputation for commanding every room was legendary. He directed, acted, and often rewrote as he pleased. What struck Plummer most was Welles's instinct to make every project about himself. Blocking, pacing, even other actors' performances were adjusted to frame Welles at the center. For someone like Plummer, who valued ensemble work and textual fidelity, this was infuriating. Welles was famously improvisational. He would rewrite lines moments before curtain, change entrances for dramatic effect, or pause rehearsals to deliver a booming monologue about his vision. Many stood in awe. Plummer saw through the showmanship. To him, this wasn't creative genius at work. It was self-indulgence disguised as inspiration. Their encounters often turned into subtle power struggles. Welles relied on his legend. Plummer relied on precision. When Welles shifted a scene to spotlight himself, Plummer pushed back with meticulous delivery, refusing to let the text bend entirely to one man's will. It wasn't open hostility, but neither man was inclined to yield. The atmosphere crackled with unspoken rivalry. Welles could also be dismissive of other actors' contributions. He offered unsolicited direction mid-rehearsal, not as collaboration but as instruction. Plummer, who bristled at condescension even from the greats, refused to be one of Welles's supporting players in the Orson Welles show. Later in life, Plummer reflected on Welles with grudging respect. He recognized the scale of his achievements and the brilliance of his vision, but admiration didn't erase the memory of working under a man who consumed all the air in the room. For Plummer, Orson Welles was the scene stealer, a dazzling genius who turned every production into his personal stage, leaving little room for anyone else to breathe. Number 7. Richard Harris. Richard Harris was a force of nature. With his rugged charisma, booming voice, and devil-may-care attitude, he became one of the most unpredictable figures in 20th century theater and film. To audiences, he was magnetic. To Christopher Plummer, he was both brilliant and infuriating. A man whose wildness didn't stop when the curtain rose. Plummer and Harris were contemporaries on the stage, both steeped in classical training. But where Plummer approached the work with rigor, Harris thrived on chaotic energy. He could be extraordinary when the mood struck him, delivering performances filled with raw intensity and poetic power, but just as often that same energy veered off course. His temper was quick, his discipline uneven, and his drinking legendary. Plummer admired Harris's natural gifts but struggled with his unpredictability. Their interactions were often laced with competitive undercurrents. Harris was notorious for testing the boundaries of every production he joined. He challenged directors, mocked authority, and brought an edge of danger into rehearsals. Plummer, while capable of sharp wit himself, preferred structured collaboration. To him, Harris's constant provocation wasn't daring, it was disruptive. Harris also had a talent for drawing attention to himself, both on and off stage. His reputation as a hellraiser preceded him. He was the man who would drink all night and then deliver a searing Shakespearean soliloquy the next day, sometimes with genius, sometimes with chaos. Plummer had no patience for that kind of inconsistency. To him, theater was sacred work, not a playground for rebellion. Yet, their relationship wasn't purely hostile. There was a kind of grudging respect between them, born of shared heritage and mutual recognition of talent. But respect didn't make Harris easier to work with. Plummer often found himself frustrated by the way Harris's antics overshadowed everything else, turning rehearsals into contests rather than collaborations. In later years, Plummer described Harris with both fondness and exasperation. He acknowledged his brilliance, even admired his fearlessness. But he also saw the cost. Richard Harris was, in Plummer's eyes, the wild card, capable of moments of greatness, but equally capable of throwing an entire production into disarray through sheer force of personality. Number 8. Julie Andrews. To the world, Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews were a dream pairing. The Sound of Music cemented them as one of Hollywood's most beloved on-screen couples. The stern captain and the radiant Maria, brought together through music and warmth. But behind the scenes, Plummer's experience working with Andrews was far more complicated. Beneath the smiles and songs, he found himself quietly battling against what he saw as an impenetrable wall of perfection. Plummer later admitted that making The Sound of Music was, for him, like being hit over the head with a Hallmark card every day. Julie Andrews was everything the film needed her to be: disciplined, optimistic, flawless in her delivery. She never missed a note, never broke character, and carried herself with a kind of effortless grace. To audiences, it was enchanting. To Plummer, it sometimes felt overly polished, almost artificial compared to his own more sardonic, layered approach. Off-camera, Andrews was famously kind, but also extremely guarded. She maintained a professional warmth that to Plummer kept a distance. He respected her work ethic immensely, yet he struggled to break through the veneer of composure. She represented a kind of theatrical ideal that he couldn't quite penetrate: unshakable, pure, and unwavering. For someone like Plummer, who thrived on irony and subtext, that was both fascinating and frustrating. He even mocked the film's sweetness by calling it The Sound of Mucus, a joke that revealed how alienated he felt from the movie's relentlessly wholesome tone. Their differing temperaments showed up subtly on screen. His restrained, skeptical energy met her sunny exuberance head-on, creating the magnetic contrast that audiences still adore. But in real life, it wasn't always easy for him to stand beside someone so universally adored and emotionally untouchable. Over time, their relationship changed. Plummer grew to love Andrews as a dear friend, praising her talent and integrity. But his initial impressions never disappeared completely. For him, she was the Ice Queen, not because she was cruel, but because she embodied a kind of idealized perfection that made real connection elusive. Julie Andrews wasn't an enemy, she was something more complicated, a mirror of everything Plummer respected and resisted at once. Number 9. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was Hollywood royalty. Fiercely independent, sharp-tongued, and utterly assured of her place in the world, she commanded every room she entered. To audiences, she was elegance and strength personified. To Christopher Plummer, working with her meant stepping into the orbit of a queen who brooked no equals. He admired her greatly, but he also saw, up close, how unyielding and imperious she could be. Plummer shared the stage with Hepburn in a production of Measure for Measure during the 1950s, a time when she was already a towering figure in both film and theater. Hepburn approached the role as if she were directing as well as acting. She analyzed other actors' performances, gave notes uninvited, and shaped the tone of rehearsals to match her vision. This wasn't insecurity, it was authority. She had earned her status, and she wielded it with a sure hand. For Plummer, this dynamic was both fascinating and frustrating. He respected strong personalities, but he valued collaboration above all. Hepburn, in contrast, operated like a commander, decisive, exacting, and intolerant of hesitation. She didn't ask, she instructed. Directors often deferred to her judgment, knowing she carried the weight of star power and critical acclaim. Plummer, never one to play the obedient subordinate, found this difficult to stomach. Their exchanges were marked by mutual recognition of talent, but also by an unspoken power struggle. Hepburn wasn't cruel, she simply had no patience for what she considered weakness or dithering. She expected everyone to rise to her level, and she had little interest in adjusting for anyone. Plummer met this with a mix of respect and resistance, unwilling to be molded but wise enough not to pick unnecessary fights. In later interviews, Plummer spoke of Hepburn with a kind of grudging admiration. He acknowledged her brilliance, her discipline, and her sheer presence, but he also made it clear, working with her was like working under a monarch. You didn't share the stage with Katharine Hepburn, you entered her court. For Christopher Plummer, Katharine Hepburn was the untouchable queen, regal, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising. He respected her, but he never forgot what it felt like to stand opposite someone who expected not collaboration, but deference. Number 10. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness was a master of understatement. Known for his refined performances in classics like The Bridge on the River Kwai and later Star Wars, he was admired for his precision and subtlety. On stage, he was equally formidable, a consummate craftsman with a deep respect for tradition. But to Christopher Plummer, working with Guinness came with its own set of frustrations. Behind the immaculate technique, Plummer encountered a man who could be emotionally distant, exacting, and quietly judgmental. Plummer respected Guinness's abilities without question. He considered him one of the great technicians of his generation, but their interactions revealed a gulf in temperament. Guinness maintained a cool, almost chilly demeanor in rehearsal rooms. He offered little warmth, and when he did speak, it was often to deliver precise, sometimes cutting observations about others' performances. Plummer, who thrived on wit and lively exchange, found this aloofness difficult to penetrate. Guinness carried himself like a man who believed there was a right way to do things, and that he knew it. He wasn't flamboyant like Rex Harrison, or tyrannical like Yul Brynner. His arrogance was quieter, woven into the certainty of his own method. He scrutinized fellow actors with a critical eye, often leaving them unsure whether they'd earned his approval. For Plummer, who refused to perform under another man's silent appraisal, this created an undercurrent of tension. Their differences were stylistic as well as personal. Plummer's performances leaned toward emotional immediacy and wit, while Guinness prized restraint and perfect form. He treated the rehearsal room almost like a chapel, where deviations from tradition were viewed with suspicion. Plummer saw this as rigidity, a refusal to embrace the unpredictability that made theater alive. In interviews, Plummer would recall Guinness with a tone of measured respect. He never dismissed his talent, but he made clear that working with him wasn't easy. There was admiration, but there was no warmth. Guinness remained, in Plummer's memory, a figure of cold perfectionism, brilliant, unbending, and remote. For Christopher Plummer, Alec Guinness was the cold perfectionist, a man whose genius was undeniable, but whose presence turned collaboration into quiet competition. It was not open hostility, but a clash of sensibilities that left its mark. Conclusion. Christopher Plummer's candor was rare. In a world where stars often buried their frustrations behind polite interviews, he spoke openly about the people who challenged him, irritated him, and in some cases pushed him to perform at his best. His list wasn't born from petty grudges. It reflected his unwavering commitment to the craft, his belief that great theater and film demanded discipline, respect, and true collaboration. Many of the names on his blacklist were towering figures in their own right. They shaped the cultural landscape as much as he did. Some frustrated him with their arrogance. Others simply represented a style or spirit that clashed with his own. But each encounter revealed something deeper about Plummer himself. His sharp eye, his refusal to be intimidated, and his insistence on meeting genius on equal footing. In the end, these rivalries and tensions didn't diminish his legacy, they enriched it. They paint a portrait of a man who worked among legends, saw them clearly, and never once lost his voice. For more emotional stories, check out this video.